The Living Dex Hardcore Nuzlocke. This is the Pokemon challenge where I nuzlocke through the main series Pokemon games with the goal of completing the Living Dex in Pokemon Home. We finally did it. We beat Generation 1 of Pokemon games, so that's Pokemon Red, Blue and Yellow, and we're going to move on to Generation 2, Gold, Silver and Crystal next. However, I did promise a video at the end of Yellow, Pokemon Yellow, of me moving the Pokemon to Pokemon Bank. That's playing there. Yeah, so we beat them. We're going to move on, but I watched the old explainer video and it feels sort of outdated, and also some rules would actually not allow for us to get very far in Gold, so I've had to change a few rules. Just the wording had to be remodeled a little bit, or there needed to be a wee adage. So I've changed the explainer, or the rules that I imposed upon myself. A new document will be linked below from every video onwards, and also this explainer video. So this is the one we're going to go off from now on. Now I'm going to start off, you can see the bullet points. I'm going to create chapters of the bullet points, so skip to whatever point you want to. If you are familiar with, for example, some of the definitions that we have to go through, just use the chapters if you want to. Let's go. Right, we're going to start off with some definitions. First of all, I've been asked, what is a living dex? Now, a living dex is defined as a collection of one of every species of Pokemon. So there are currently 1,025 species of Pokemon according to the Pokédex. According to the Pokédex, there are 1,025 species of Pokemon. So I want one of each of them. It's essentially the core slogan of Pokemon that it used to have. Gotta catch them all. You want one of every Pokemon. Now, I have tweaked the definition of species slightly for this challenge. So I won't be going after 1,025. I'll be going after 1,302, I think is the number. You can check the number in my tracker. I have a tracker where I track which Pokemon we've caught for the Living Dex. And there, just hit the tab Pokédex and you can see the full list of Pokemon that I'm going after in this challenge. But let me explain my definition of species for this challenge. So some species of Pokemon have multiple forms. These form differences, so long as they are named and storable in Pokemon Home, are considered individual species of Pokemon in the context of this challenge. However, varying natures and abilities don't create an individual species of Pokemon. So a lot to unpack there. We'll start with the natures and abilities. If you don't know what they are, basically every Pokemon can have one of 26 natures. I think it's 26, it might be 25. No, it has to be 26, I think. It can have any of 26 natures, which boosts one stat and decreases another stat. Basically, that for me doesn't create its own species, just because I have a different natured Bulbasaur than the one I had before. And also abilities, Pokemon come with 1 to 3 abilities. If it has a different ability to another one, that doesn't create its own species for me, because these days you can use patches and items in game to change the ability of a Pokemon, the ability capsule, so they don't create their own species for me. However, form differences that are named and storable in Pokemon Home do. Now I've prepared here an example, or a few examples. So Deerling, for example, I've put 2 forms there. Has 4 forms, 1 for each season. So this is the spring form, I believe, and this is the autumn or fall form. I consider these individual species in the context of this challenge, so I want all 4 forms of Deerling. Sorry, I have to that way. I want all 4 forms of Deerling to be caught and added to the Living Dex. Then Unknown is probably better known than Deerling. Has 28 forms, 26 for each letter of the alphabet, so it's representing F here, and then exclamation mark and question mark, which was introduced later on. So I want all of those 28 forms. I consider them all individual species. Vivillon might be more popular amongst Pokemon Go players and of course Living Dex challengers. I want all of the patterns of Vivillon. I can't remember how many Vivillon has, but it's quite a few of them, and we want to try and get as many as possible throughout this challenge. I consider each pattern an individual species because they're named as well, the patterns. I believe that is the meadow pattern, if I'm not mistaken, but correct me if I'm wrong. Then also, in Generation 4, so that's when Diamond and Pearl came out, Pokemon introduced the concept of what in biology is termed sexual dimorphism. In the community, it's usually called gender differences, but I prefer the term sexual dimorphism because it explains a lot better what it's about. So in animals, for example, you have the peacock is a great example. Especially birds in general are a very good example for this, where the male peacock has the green feathers and, you know, the blue eye-like things, whereas the female peacock doesn't have that. I believe the female peacock is brown with a few black spots and all that there. So the male and the female of one species of animal look different from each other. And essentially Pokemon introduced that concept as well, but only from Diamond and Pearl onwards. So as an example, we have here Frillish. The female Frillish are pink and male Frillish are blue. I consider these individual species in the context of this challenge, so I want both a male Frillish and a female Frillish and a male Frillish. And there are plenty of Pokemon that have this. I'm just using some examples here. Then in Generation 7, I believe, Sun and Moon, Pokemon introduced the concept of regional forms. So Pokemon that are essentially still the same species, but because they're in a different habitat, look different because they had to adapt to a different habitat. But they haven't given them their own Pokedex number, so they don't consider them different species, but I do for this challenge. So the example here is Zigzagoon when it came out in its Hoenn form. That's the way it looked. And then in Sword and Shield, where the environment is a lot colder, or I don't know why exactly, because of the punk rock movement, it evolved to sort of look like this. And that's the same Pokemon, according to the Pokedex, but it has two different forms. So I want both of those forms. I count them as individual species in the context of this challenge. I'm not trying to argue that this should be considered their individual species in general. Just in the context of this challenge, I want both of those forms. I want all Pokemon with sexual dimorphism. I want both versions. And if Pokemon have different forms, I want all of their forms. Now, I did say named and storable in Pokemon Home. Those are important words because Spinda, who I believe has over 1 billion different forms, doesn't have the forms named. So we're not going to go off that fool's errand to try and collect all 4 billion forms of Spinda. So Spinda will not be included in this challenge, or well, I will catch one Spinda, but that will count as all of the forms for Spinda. We consider it to have only one species because the forms aren't named, the individual. I mean, the Pokemon Company would have to name over 1 billion forms, so thankfully they didn't do that. Then we have Kyurem. That's a great example of a Pokemon that isn't storable in Pokemon Home. That's because it is a fusion between two Pokemon and they just don't allow it to be stored fused, so we can't catch it. We can catch Kyurem and Reshiram, which is what it's the fusion of, individually and have those, but Kyurem White doesn't count as its individual species in the context of this challenge. And then we also have the two battle forms, or battle exclusive forms, which are the Mega Evolutions. Of course, because they're only in battle, and the Gigantamax can only appear in battle, so they can't appear in a storage app or program, so we're not going to go after those. I hope that clarifies what I meant by species exactly and what I'm going after and what not. You can check out again, as I said, the spreadsheet linked below. Just hit the tab Pokedex and then you'll see which ones I am going after. So that's Living Dex and species defined. Let's define Nuzlocke. I think, I was asked what is a Nuzlocke. Now, I'm going to read this off of Bulbapedia. Thank you very much, Bulbapedia, for the definition. So at its very basic core, Nuzlocke is a way of playing through the Pokemon games that supposed to make the games more difficult. And it basically introduces 2 rules. A lot of people add more rules, but at its core, it's just 2 rules that are added when you play through Pokemon. The first one is the player may only catch the first wild Pokemon encountered in each area and no others. If the first wild Pokemon encountered faints or flees, there are no second chances. So that's rule 1 of Nuzlocke. And rule 2 is any Pokemon that faints is considered to have passed away and must be released. That's rule 2. That's essentially what a Nuzlocke is. If a Pokemon faints, it's gone. You can't use it anymore. And you can only catch the first Pokemon you encounter. If you fail to catch it, you don't get a second chance per area in each area of a game. So that's Nuzlocke at its core. What makes the Nuzlocke hardcore? We'll get into that in a second when we go to the battle rules, and also some other rules make it hardcore, but essentially the battle rules are what make it hardcore. Let's see, Nuzlocke. So what else do we have to define? The Pokemon challenge, where I Nuzlocke through the main series Pokemon games with the goal of completing the Living Dex, and Pokemon Home. So those are 2 terms that we need to define. Also, I just saw we're going to go into yellow here. I want to pause it at yellow because I want to show you something here, which is part of the explainer. Right, so main series Pokemon games. Let's define that. So essentially the Pokemon Company says if a game is main series or if it's a spin-off, and we're going to use those games. They're listed in the explainer down below. They go from red, blue, yellow all the way to Scarlet and Violet. Legends ZA will also be a main series game. Crucially, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are considered main series, and Legends Arceus also. So yeah, those are considered main series, but games like Pokemon Go, Pokemon Snap, or Pokemon Pinball, Coliseum, Stadium, all of those aren't part of what I'm playing through. I'm just playing the main series as defined by the Pokemon Company. You can check the exact list below. Yeah, we'll be playing those. Main series Pokemon games, and Pokemon Home was the next thing I wanted to define because I've been asked what is Pokemon Home. I'm reading this of home.pokemon.com. So Pokemon Home is a cloud service for Nintendo Switch and compatible mobile devices designed as a place where all Pokemon can gather. So essentially it's an app where you can move your Pokemon that you used when you played through the game to store them there. And I think the idea used to be that you could bring them to future games and continue playing with the Pokemon that you raised in Blue, and then play them, I don't know, in Scarlet and Violet. That was the core idea, but since there's now so much storage, I don't know exactly how many Pokemon, but I think you can store over 3,000 Pokemon there, or 3,000 exactly. So it's the perfect place to store your Living Dex, essentially, and to keep filling up from the games. Now, the app that we're using here, Pokemon Bank, as it says at the top, is the predecessor to Pokemon Home. It was for the 3DS only, but it was essentially what Pokemon Home is, just on the 3DS and its predecessor. So I need to move the Pokemon to Pokemon Bank, and I can move them from Pokemon Bank to Pokemon Home, and then that's where the collection, the Living Dex, will be hopefully completed one day. Right, I think that's all of the terms in the starting phrase defined. I think we can get into the rules. Now, the goal should be obvious, I stated. I mean, it's to Nuzlocke through the main series games with the goal of completing the Living Dex in Pokemon Home. So I don't think I have to repeat that. That should be obvious. We're trying to catch every Pokemon by Nuzlocking through the Pokemon games and putting them in Pokemon Home. Right, now order. The games are to be played and completed in order of release and with the knowledge and lore of Pokemon before... Did I read that correctly? The games are to be played and completed in order of release and with the knowledge and lore of Pokemon before the release of the next generation of Pokemon games. Okay, so we're going to play them in the order that they were released, and crucially with the knowledge and lore of Pokemon before the release of the next game. So... why I did this is because Pokemon, usually with a new generation of games, introduces a new concept. So the new concept in Gold and Silver was sort of breeding. In Generation 3, I think it was abilities. and natures. And then in Generation 4, for example, it was sexual dimorphism. Yeah, and they keep introducing new things, like Mega Evolution was the thing in Gen 6. So I want to keep this challenge open to new concepts that may come in the future. So yeah, essentially that's why I added that. And one example that we will be abiding by, we already know, as I said earlier on, sexual dimorphism was introduced in Generation 4. That's Diamond and Pearl. Platinum as well, but that's the games where Generation 4 started. So the sexual dimorphism doesn't exist before that. There is male and female of most Pokemon, you know, the ones that aren't neutral or don't have a sex. But after Generation 4, the visual difference was introduced between the male and the female. So only from Generation 4 onwards are we allowed to catch the opposite sex of the Pokemon that we didn't have yet. Essentially, that's why this is in here, because when something new gets introduced in future games, I want this challenge to be open to new games. So I want to keep going as long as Pokemon games are released, if possible. Right, so much for order. Let's get into battle rules. Normally in the document I go through obtaining Pokemon here, but there's a few concept and battle rules that I need to go through before we can go through the other ones. So battle rules, let's start with no escape. This is essentially, these battle rules are what makes it the Nuzlocke hardcore. So not only are we obtaining only the first Pokemon in each area, and Pokemon that faint are boxed, but we're imposing other rules on top of it. So first of all, no escape. I may not select the run option in the battle menu. Very simple. I can't escape from any battle, wild or trainer. Well, you can't escape from trainer battles anyway, but I may not escape. I have to actually take on every battle that I come across. That's in order to increase the difficulty, of course, because if you can just run from the Pokemon, you know, you mightn't end up as badly hurt as you could be in other cases. Right, then set mode. Set mode. If possible, the game must be played in set mode. Games that cannot be played in set mode shall be played as if they were set to set mode. Now, in the old games, you could change between switch mode and set mode. Essentially, switch mode allowed you, if you fainted your opponent's Pokemon, to get like a Zwischenzug, a turn between turns, to switch your own Pokemon out. That was switch mode. Set mode doesn't allow you to do that. And essentially, switch mode makes the game a lot easier. I think any competitive battler, VGC battler, will tell you that sometimes your Pokemon fainting is actually an advantage to you, because you get a free switch into a new Pokemon and you get like a new wind to take on your opponent. And if you have switch mode on, you can counter that positive side of getting your Pokemon fainted by just switching to something that's going to be strong against what they are switching to. So that's why set mode doesn't allow that. It doesn't give you the Zwischenzug, the turn in between turns, to switch your own Pokemon. So we will be playing on set mode later on, and I can't remember when exactly they took it out of the game. So it will ask you if you want to switch Pokemon. I have to hit no there and use my actual turn to switch out Pokemon. I am, of course, allowed to switch Pokemon. It's just that I have to do it during my turn and not on the in-between turn that you would get, or yeah, that the game offers you. Long explanation there, but I feel that's a difficult one to explain. Right, no over-leveling, or level cap as it's named there. So when battling a gym leader, the rival, a villain team leader, or a member of the Elite Four, the level of a Pokemon in my current party may not exceed that of the opponent's highest trained Pokemon. This rule takes effect after the first rival battle. I have had to add that in because otherwise we couldn't complete any game going forward. Because Gen 1 is the only game where the rival battle happens immediately after you pick your starter. After that, in all of the games, or in most games, you only battle your rival after you've completed some other errand first. So it's after the first rival battle. We don't have to keep the level cap because we can't escape from battles. That would sort of, those two rules sort of don't work together. So just for the first rival battle, I don't have a level cap. But when battling a gym leader, a rival, a villain team leader, or a member of the Elite Four, my Pokemon on my team are not allowed to be at a higher level than the highest level Pokemon of my opponent. But it's only for those ones, because some trainers have very weak Pokemon and I can't foresee every single trainer. But I will look up in advance what levels that those trainers have and be below it. If I have a Pokemon that's above the level cap, I can't bring it to the battle. It has to be boxed for that battle. Or, well, yeah, it can't be on the team. Essentially, that's the level cap. Then, no items. I may not use items from the item menu in battles unless I am legitimately attempting to obtain a Pokemon, in which case the use of any kind of Pokeball is permitted. Held items are therefore allowed. So I may not use items from the item menu in battle. That's the way I'm stating the rule, and I think that way, unless I'm trying to catch a Pokemon, legitimately trying to obtain a Pokemon, I don't know if there's maybe some way where I could throw a Pokeball at an opponent's Pokemon to waste the turn intentionally or something. I'm not allowed to do so. Only when I'm legitimately attempting to obtain a Pokemon may I use the items menu, and then I may use any Pokeball. I'm not allowed to use potions or any other items in battle. However, Pokemon can come in with held items and have held items. However, there's a slight thing to these held items, and that is the next thing: no duplicates. So I may not have multiple Pokemon with the same Pokedex number on my team. That's just a general VGC rule, and actually impossible to have, since we're going to get into that later on with Dupes Clause. That won't be possible to do. Then I may not have multiple Pokemon holding the same item during battle on my team. So I can't have 3 Pokemon holding a berry. I can only have 1 Pokemon holding a berry. They need to be individual items for the team. Yeah, right. That's so much for the battle rules. That's essentially what makes the Nuzlocke hardcore. But let's get into some of the Nuzlocke rules, the way I have defined them for this challenge. So, obtaining Pokemon. I may freely choose the method of obtaining Pokemon, but I'm limited to only attempting to obtain the first Pokemon encountered per area per game. Apart from selecting the starter Pokemon, this rule applies as soon as I first acquire a device that allows me to obtain Pokemon. So, as it states there, I added that I may freely choose the method of obtaining. So I can choose if I want to fish, if I want to go in the tall grass, if I want to get a gift Pokemon off somebody, or if I want to hatch an egg in an area. I'm free to choose that, but I'm still limited to only getting one of those, and only the first one of those. So per area, I can only get 1 Pokemon, and I only get 1 shot at it. If I fail it, I've essentially missed a Pokemon in that area. Now, usually people add Dupes Clause is what they call it, essentially duplicates clause. Essentially, because I have no escape, I worded it this way: I must defeat encountered Pokemon and encounter new Pokemon for obtaining as often as necessary. If I've already caught a species of Pokemon from the encountered Pokemon's evolution family in the game being played. So if you remember, in Pokemon Yellow, I caught a Geodude in Mount Moon. And then after I beat the rival, before we went through Victory Road, I said there were no new encounters. So we were still missing Graveler, which Geodude evolves into Graveler, for the Living Dex. But because we had Geodude already, that counts as duplicates clause because it's the same evolutionary family. I couldn't catch Graveler in Yellow then. So only one of a Pokemon's evolutionary family per game, if that makes sense. Yeah, but because I'm nuzlocking through multiple games, I need an extra Dupes Clause, and I call this the intergame Dupes Clause. So essentially a Dupes Clause that applies across games, and this I've worded as follows: I must defeat encountered Pokemon, encounter new Pokemon for obtaining as often as necessary. That's the same as above. If I have caught all species available legitimately of the encountered Pokemon's evolution family in the games already completed. So when I was playing Blue, I started with Red and I caught a Machop in Rock Tunnel. So when I was playing through Blue, I encountered Machop again as my first legitimate, or as my first encounter. So I caught it because I didn't have all of the legitimately available Pokemon of its evolution families, because I was missing Machoke, its evolution still. Now, available legitimately because I don't have a way to trade until Generation 4. Machamp is considered illegitimate until Generation 4 in the context of this challenge. So when I went through Yellow and I encountered Machop, I couldn't catch it because I had caught all Pokemon of that evolution family that are available legitimately to this point, and the game's already completed. So that's why I couldn't catch a third Machop. It's sort of like a Dupes Clause to prevent me from getting duplicates in the Living Dex. Again, yeah. Also, the application of this rule can lead to obtaining Jeopardy Pokemon. Now, that's a term that I have coined for this challenge. I'll just read to you what I termed it as. A Jeopardy Pokemon is defined as any Pokemon whose fainting would result in the creation of a duplicate entry in the Living Dex. Therefore, if a Jeopardy Pokemon faints, the game in which the Jeopardy Pokemon fainted must be restarted. So let's use that example again of Machop. So I caught a Machop in Red, didn't bother to evolve it, finished the challenge, so we sent a Machop essentially to the Living Dex. Then I come across Machop again in Blue, and I have to catch it, or well, it is, I don't have to catch, I could fail it, but it is my first encounter in Rock Tunnel. So I catch Machop, and because I send fainted Pokemon, I will explain later on why, also go towards the Living Dex in this challenge. But because I already had a Machop, and that would create a duplicate entry if it fainted, or if I finished the game before evolving it, it would create a duplicate entry in the Living Dex where, if you remember, we want only one of every species of Pokemon. So it is a Jeopardy Pokemon. If it faints at any time before it evolves to an evolution that we don't have in the Living Dex yet, I have to restart the game. In Yellow, famously, Poliwag almost fainted, which it was a Jeopardy Pokemon because we got Poliwag in... Did we get I can't remember if we got it in Red or Blue, but we got not only Poliwag, we already had Poliwhirl from Red and Blue, so we needed to evolve Poliwag all the way to Poliwrath to unjeopardize it, to make it a legitimate entry in the Living Dex. So as long as the Pokemon is an evolution that I already have in the Living Dex, it is considered Jeopardy, and if it faints, that's an additional rule, I need to restart immediately. Right, I hope that was explained well enough. If not, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments. I'd love to explain it. I'd even redo the video, honestly. Right, so that's the Dupes clauses. Then Shiny Clause. Most Nuzlockers use this. If I encounter a shiny Pokemon, I may always attempt to obtain it or to catch it. If it's obtaining does not fall under the rules specified above, the obtained shiny Pokemon must be deposited in the PC and cannot be used in a challenge. So say I'm grinding in Viridian Forest somewhere in Red and Blue, and I encounter a Caterpie there, a shiny one, and I've already got my encounter for Viridian Forest. I can attempt to catch the Caterpie, but I'm not allowed to use it in the challenge. It has to be just deposited in the PC. It's just because shiny Pokemon are rare, and if you come across one, you know, it's a nice wee memory that you caught one there. So you're allowed to catch it, but you're not allowed to use it in the challenge, so you just box it. If it is your first Pokemon you encounter in the area, then you are allowed to use it. It's just, yeah, we don't want multiple Pokemon caught in one area being used, which is why if it isn't the first Pokemon encountered, the shiny Pokemon just has to be boxed and you can't go near it. Right, let's move on to eggs and breeding. I've had to change this, or not had to change this, I had a change of heart when it comes to this. So now eggs and egg location. Gifted eggs are a legal method of obtaining Pokemon. The area an egg was hatched in is used to determine the area it was obtained from. No other Pokemon may therefore be obtained from that area. So where I hatch an egg is the area where it is caught. I believe the games later on follow that thing as well, but in Gen 2, unfortunately, it doesn't have that thing yet. But where it hatches, that is the area that we consider it to be caught, and I can't catch any other Pokemon in that area. So I can't be backtracking with an egg to somewhere where I've caught a Pokemon already. I have to go to a new area to hatch an egg, and where it hatches, it counts as my encounter for that place. So I need to be very careful hatching eggs, because if I have 2 Pokemon from the same location, it's a restart. Breeding. Now, I used to want to allow breeding, but I've had a change of heart, and now the rule simply states Pokemon may not be bred as part of this challenge. I just don't want to see it, because yeah, it was too complicated the way I focused on doing it, and I believe that all baby Pokemon will eventually be obtainable in the wild, or encounterable in the wild. It's just not in Gen 2 yet. So we've just taken breeding off the table, because it would also allow for probably creating Pokemon with good IVs and things like that. So we just don't want breeding in the game. I can accept gift eggs or mystery eggs from other people. Yeah, but I can't breed my own Pokemon as part of the challenge. Right, trading and transfer is the next point. Yeah, trading and transfer. So, trade evolutions. Pokemon that require trading for evolution may be traded for evolution at any time. However, any held items required for the trade evolution to trigger must originate from the game evolving the Pokemon for this challenge. Also, when trading, any other benefits must be limited to the utmost minimum. So no trading in of items into the game or anything. Just trade to get the evolution, trade it back, and then that's it. I can use the Pokemon. No trying to get extra Pokedex entries or anything like that. Just, I can trade whenever I want to trade evolution. But yeah, I have to limit. I can't be trading items into the game through it that way. Now, in-game trades, as well as trades that aren't for trade evolving, are not a legal method of obtaining Pokemon. So I've done this essentially because I want the original trainer, the trainer name on the Pokemon, the trainer name's always stored with the Pokemon, to be the one of the game that I used. So if you might have noticed, we played through Red with our character named Red, we played through Blue with our character named Blue, we played through Yellow with our character named Yellow. I want the OT, the original trainer, to reflect the game that we were that the Pokemon was obtained from. And if you trade in game, it has a different OT, which then I would argue makes it difficult to tell which game the Pokemon came from exactly. So yeah, that's why I don't want to allow in-game trades or trades in general for evolving. All Pokemon have to have the OT of the player that is playing the game. Right, transfer. Pokemon from previous generations may only be transferred once the challenge in the game used for transfer has been completed. I mean, that's pretty simple. We didn't need to use a game for transfer for Pokemon Bank. Well, you do need to insert a game, but you don't touch the game. You can just move them. But later on, when Gen 3 comes along, we're going to have to move from Ruby and Sapphire to Diamond and Pearl, and then Diamond and Pearl to X and not to X and Y, to Black and White. And from Black and White, we can then move to Pokemon Bank again. So I can only move from Ruby and Sapphire once I've completed Diamond, and then Pearl as well. I can move the Pokemon forward to the next games. Right, nicknames is the next point, I believe. Yeah, every Pokemon that is obtained must be nicknamed. Every game should follow a different theme for its nicknames. Of course, any suggestions by viewers or in comments or anything, I'm very happy to oblige. Nicknames must be safe for work in order to prevent its loss upon transfer to Pokemon Bank or Pokemon Home. So Pokemon Bank and Pokemon Home have nickname checkers, and if there are offensive terms in it, the nickname will be removed, unfortunately. I think I spoke about while playing Pokemon Yellow that I once caught a Murkrow and I did an anagram of Murkrow, which was Workrum, and that nickname was removed. So probably because of the word rum, I guess. I don't know of any other offensive words reference to, you know, the beverage. So yeah, the names need to be safe for work. Thankfully, all of the names that we used so far worked, and I'm very glad about that. We didn't lose a single nickname. I'm still considering that if we lose a nickname of a Pokemon, we might stroke it off the Living Dex. I'm not sure yet. I have to see if Pokemon Home allows now for a renaming of Pokemon and potentially seeing if we can get the old name back again. But yeah, essentially, maybe we might do, if it loses the nickname, the Pokemon stroked off the Living Dex and we need to catch it again. Right, fainting is the next point. If a Pokemon faints, it must be deposited in the PC and can no longer be used in the challenge. The fainted Pokemon will, however, still be part of the Living Dex, and I'll get into that, why that is exactly, in a second. If I'm unable to proceed in the game because I no longer have a Pokemon that can learn a required HM, I must restart the challenge in that game. If the player whites out, the game is considered lost and must be restarted. So those are 3 methods I can lose. Oh no, that's 2 methods. So when a Pokemon faints, I need to put it in the box. I usually used box 12 up to now when it fainted, and I still move them onto the Living Dex. I'll explain why later on. If I'm unable to proceed in the game because I no longer can use a HM, so I can't use, some players allow, Nuzlockers allow for the usage of Pokemon that have a HM until you get a new one that can, but if I can't use HMs because the Pokemon that had the HM fainted, I need to restart the game. And if the player whites out, you're essentially considered to have passed away and you must restart. And then Jeopardy Pokemon, obviously. If a Jeopardy Pokemon faints, that's an instant restart. Okay, so that's fainting. Let's get into cheating. We're going to start playing this video here again because we're coming up to that point now. Right, cheating, RNG manipulation, and TOS. The game shall be played without cheating, RNG manipulation, or any violation of the Pokemon Company's terms of service. That's just a thing. We're playing on an official 3DS, legitimate hardware and legitimate software. Then let's get to the ending. A game ends once the Elite Four has been beaten after all post-game content has been unlocked. Now, I don't necessarily have to complete the post-game content. It just has to be unlocked. Once all post-game content is unlocked and I defeat the Elite Four again, that's when the challenge ends. Now, reward. Upon completing a game, a Route 1 or equivalent Pokemon may be captured. That's what's happening on screen now. In order to enable the transfer of all Pokemon used in the challenge to Pokemon Home. So the thing is, you need to leave one Pokemon behind. Otherwise, you couldn't play the game anymore. So Pokemon prevents moving all Pokemon out of the game. So as a reward, if I beat the challenge, I can go to Route 1 or whatever is the equivalent route in the game, catch a Pokemon, don't give it a nickname, and then move all of the other Pokemon to Pokemon Home or Pokemon Bank. And then we have punishment, which is termed a bit weirdly, but any violation of the above rules shall result in the game where the violation took place needing to be restarted. That's simple. Then clarifications. If a situation arises that has not been defined within this document, it is advised to refer to the video below and create rules in the spirit of it before the game is continued. Now, I've linked to Pichal, thanks Jan, to his video where he talks about his Nuzlocke rules, and I think that's a great place to build your own rules off of. Thanks again, Jan, for that video. And yeah, so there's only one thing left to do here now, which is to explain why fainted Pokemon are part of the Living Dex. Now, this might be a bit controversial, but I think my argument holds true. So, fainted Pokemon are transferred to Pokemon Home as part of the Living Dex for 2 reasons. Now, the first reason has 2 points, so there's sort of 3 points coming up here. Firstly, increased difficulty. Counting fainted Pokemon towards the Living Dex increases the difficulty of the challenge in the following ways. So there's 2 ways it increases the difficulty, if you ask me. Failing to evolve a Pokemon before it faints creates a lower level evolution entry of a Pokemon's evolution family in the Living Dex. So failing to evolve Oddish, creates Oddish in the Living Dex. Therefore, almost certainly guaranteeing a Jeopardy Pokemon in a later game, because I need to get Gloom, and I'll probably only be able to catch Oddish, so it'll make the game more difficult, because I will have a Jeopardy Pokemon on hard, as opposed to deleting the entry of that Pokemon, which simply allows for capture in a later game without added pressure. So essentially, I'm arguing that if you fail to evolve a Pokemon and it faints, you should count it towards it, because then you still have to get its evolution, and if you don't, that adds a Jeopardy Pokemon in a later game, essentially. Then the other reason why it increases the difficulty, and I need to pause the video here again quickly because it's going to end here, is not counting a fainted Pokemon towards the Living Dex allows for a loophole where I could intentionally sacrifice a strong species of Pokemon just before the challenge ends to enable the use of the same species of Pokemon in a later game. I've talked about this, I think, during Pokemon Yellow as well, where Salamence is pretty overpowered in Generation 3, and essentially what I could do is just use Salamence, catch Salamence, and then take it to the champion battle, the final battle, and then intentionally let it faint so that I can use it again in the next game. So this means that by counting fainted Pokemon, if I intentionally faint Salamence in that way, I'm punished and can't use it in the future games because it has been added to the Living Dex. It's just a loophole that I wanted to cover, that I felt was important to cover for, because that would have been a huge loophole in the definition. But for me, the more important reason why fainted Pokemon are part of the Living Dex is commemoration of its contribution to the challenge. Now, I've worded it this way. A Pokemon cannot faint without having been part of the player's team, which suggests it has contributed to the challenge. Even if it faints in the first battle it is used, the player went through the effort of capturing the Pokemon and at least planned on using it, and was therefore forced to adapt to the Pokemon's fainting. Every Pokemon has by this standard contributed at least a little to the challenge. And I want to bring up Horndrill here again, the Nidoran male from Pokemon Yellow. If it had not fainted and taken the hits by the Pidgeotto and cleared the debuff, the sand attack debuff, and Pikachu in Viridian Forest in the first part, we would have lost that run. Essentially, we beat Pokemon Yellow on attempt 1 because of Horndrill's sacrifice. Because otherwise we would have had to restart in part 1. If we don't count it, because it's sacrifice. No, we wouldn't have had to restart in part 1. But the whole we might have had to restart, because who knows if we would have won the battle if we hadn't sacrificed. So the thing is, Nidoran's contribution, Horndrill's contribution, was so valuable, it saved the run. And I think that should be commemorated. Every fainted Pokemon played a role, and it should be commemorated. And that's why I believe fainted Pokemon should be part of the Living Dex. Yeah, I think I was a bit not mumbling, but I was a bit incoherent there at the end. But I hope you understand the main message. It makes it more difficult because once I've used the Pokemon, I can't use it again. So Salamence, for example, and also commemoration of its contribution. So Nidoran male saved the run in Pokemon Yellow. I'm pretty sure it did. Because basically the rest of my team were Jeopardy Pokemon. And if I had sacrificed those, I would have had to restart. So it was the only Pokemon that I could sacrifice legitimately without having to restart. And by doing so, it saved the run, and we could keep going, and we in fact beat Pokemon Yellow on the first attempt, which is a new thing for this channel, to beat a game on the first attempt. Yeah, that's why I want Pokemon, even if they're fainted, to count towards the Living Dex. So There's a few rules under consideration in that thing as well, but we'll talk about that some other time. I hope the video was comprehensible and coherent. If it wasn't, please don't hesitate to ask any questions in the comments below. Again, I have the explainer document linked below. I have the spreadsheet where I track my progress, as well as the full Pokedex of which species of Pokemon I'm going after. Exactly linked down below. There are no stupid questions. Well, there probably will be now that I've said that, but honestly, I will answer any questions about this. In fact, I would even re-record this video to make a more coherent video if it was not very good and you didn't understand what I was talking about. I hope it was comprehensible. It's difficult to get all these ideas down into it, especially because I had to also explain some very basic terms, which I was asked about what they are. So yeah, I'm hoping that this suffices. If it doesn't, let me know and I'll answer the questions. If I see the same question pop up a few times, I might redo the video to explain it more coherently. But yeah, that's the Living Dex Hardcore Nuzlocke explained. We've seen the Pokemon being moved to Pokemon Bank from Generation 1. The next Pokemon upload on this channel will be Pokemon Gold. And I hope to see you there. Goodbye and good luck. That's the wrong button.